There are mornings when history changes, not with a shout but with a cough, the last dry gasp of an engine that will not turn. On such a winter dawn in the Ardennes, the sound of silence said more than any staff briefing. If you enjoy clear, deeply researched storytelling that turns hard numbers into lived reality, consider subscribing so you never miss the next chapter. In the freezing dark before sunrise near Honsfeld, the lead Tiger tank of Joachim Peiper's armoured column coughed, sputtered and died, and the stillness that followed was the verdict. The driver tried again to rouse the Maybach heart. Nothing answered. Around that stalled machine, the supposedly invincible spearhead of Germany's winter gamble lay seized in ice and emptiness. The Kampfgruppe was not merely delayed, it was paralyzed. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks and roughly 5,000 of the Waffenschutzzstaffel's most feared troops sat motionless on iron-hard ground, while ahead, the American forward position at Honsfeld lay, abandoned like a stage set after the actors have fled. What mattered now was not doctrine, not elan, not the boast of a surprise offensive, but whether there was fuel in the tanks. Then came the discovery that felt like a miracle, and in the same breath revealed the scale of an opponent Germany had never truly understood. Peiper's men moved through the vacated depot and saw them rows upon rows of olive-drab cans, the 5-gallon American jerrycan multiplied into pyramids. Hot coffee still steamed in metal cups, a quiet insult to a force that had learned to count victory in sips and drips. Cans were pried open, the sharp scent of high-octane gasoline rose, and hands moved with frantic purpose, sloshing American fuel into German machines. Peiper walked the stacks and did the arithmetic roughly 50,000 gallons enough on paper to push the column to the Meuse. The cashier in this single forward temporary point surpassed what some German divisions had seen in months, yet even as the metal glinted and the engines began to drink a heavier recognition settled on paper. If the Americans could afford to abandon this much, if a mere forward point held what Berlin would assign guards and prayers to protect, then the scale of the war was not tactical at all. It was mathematical, industrial, and final. The epiphany had been available in memoranda months earlier. In June of 1944, Albert Speer laid before Adolf Hitler a report that should have ended offensive dreaming. Allied bombing had shattered synthetic fuel output, the ersatz lifeblood of the Wehrmacht. The lunar works fell from 175,000 tons in April to 5,000 by September. Politz, Bleckhammer, Brooks and other hydrogenation plants limped at less than a tenth of capacity. Production tables told a story of collapse. Across the ocean, the United States refined roughly 1.8 billion barrels of crude in 1944, Germany, counting everything it could synthesize and squeeze from captured Romanian fields, scraped together about 33 million. In plain ratios, German output was less than 2% of American production. It was horse harness and hand carts arrayed against an age of petroleum. Yet the Ardennes plan at its core proposed to fix arithmetic with theft, take what the enemy has, and keep moving. The offensive, according to German logistical calculations, needed about 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. High Command nominally allocated 5 million, but only about half of that would reach the start line in time, choked by wrecked railways and airstruck bridges. The plan wagered the whole operation on capturing Allied stocks, which is another way of saying the plan confessed weakness while pretending to strength. The Allied answer to distance and appetite was altogether different. They had engineered a petroleum web across the theatre. Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, pushed fuel under the English Channel, and a growing lattice of inland pipes moved it forward once ashore. Where pipe ended, wheels took over. The Red Ball Express, a war within a war, threw 6,000 trucks onto colour-coded routes and ran them, day and night, a humming diesel-fueled conveyor that delivered 12,500 tons of supplies each day in its initial peak, and later scaled the whole system to 20,000 tons daily capacity. By December, the Allied armies in northwest Europe were consuming about 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and receiving roughly 1.4 million, which meant they were building reserves even as they fought. Peiper understood in his bones what his staff tables already knew: in modern operations, fuel outranked ammunition, because without fuel the guns rode nowhere and the firepower existed only on paper. Yet he had been made the Schwerpunkt, the decisive knife point of the winter offensive, and the orders that came down to him 2 days before the jump-off said the quiet part aloud he would reach the Meuse if he captured American fuel. The allocation for Kampfgruppe Piper at the start was approximately 31,000 gallons, fuel for perhaps 50 miles of combat maneuver, when the river lay about 65 miles away. The gap was not a tactical problem, it was baked into the plan. Piper therefore issued conservation rules like a quartermaster rather than a raider single file, to reduce throttle-heavy weaving, no idling longer than 5 minutes, every chance to seize an American fuel point, elevated above even attractive tactical objectives. Meanwhile, over the ridgeline, an American tank battalion scribbled in its diary that it had received an 8,000-gallon shipment, the third such delivery of the week, and the storage tanks were already full. There was a thunderous opening to the German attack, a barrage whose volume cleverly masked the austerity behind it. Paper's column rolled out late, and almost at once the Ardennes reminded maproom optimists that roads on paper can be country lanes under tires. Lanes narrowed to funnels, dirt and frost combined to slow-tracked vehicles, bottlenecks formed and engines were forced to idle. An intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of 18 Americans, or to use the unromantic language of logistics, 18 well-armed obstacles held up the armoured spearhead for nearly 10 hours. Those hours were paid for in gallons that would not come back. By the time the column broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on the second day, roughly 20 miles of progress had consumed about 40% of the fuel on board. That would have been discouraging if not for the sight that awaited them. A Class 3 Bravo forward fuel point, which in American doctrine was only a temporary fueling station, revealed itself as immense stacks of 5-gallon cans, 3 meters high, and stretching across the depot like low hills of metal. The volume surpassed what a German panzer division might receive across a month. The label said temporary. The fuel's quality was another punchline to a cruel joke. German Maybach engines were tuned for roughly 74 octane. The captured gasoline often blended upward with aviation fuel was so hot that some engines coughed and ran roughly until mechanics adjusted mixture and timing. In the depot office, shipping manifests told a story that traveled farther than any tank would in that winter. Drilled in Texas, shipped to New York, convoyed to Liverpool, moved across the Channel into Normandy, then hauled roughly 400 miles by truck to Honsfeld, all in mere weeks. A copy of the Stars and Stripes newspaper lay nearby with a headline announcing a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of pushing 300,000 gallons each day. Piper read the papers, and his face, according to those who stood with him, drained of color. One line in the American web matched or exceeded the total gasoline he could hope to expend across the entire offensive. While Germany's fuel collapse starved every arm, the Luftwaffe grounded aircraft and cut pilot training from hundreds of flight hours to a fraction. The surface navy essentially ceased to sail. Civilians surrendered private motor traffic. The Gestapo chased thefts measured in liters. American oil regions like the East Texas field alone outproduced entire occupied regions of Europe. American refineries ran so hot that Standard Oil tinkered with new byproducts simply because there was crude to spare. Fueled by the jackpot at Honsfeld, Piper's column lunged forward and seized additional supply points, picking up rations, ammunition, and more maps. Those maps and the view from the road said the same thing: fuel lay everywhere. Crossroads hid depots, and the 1st United States Army by itself held reserves measured in the millions of gallons. The pressure on Piper's clock and tanks never relented. He drove towards Stavelot, where a depot held on the order of 2.19 million gallons, a figure that if taken intact would guarantee a reach to the Meuse. But the Americans were not wagering their river crossings on German mercy. Engineers had been alerted, and their orders were simple, brutal, and entirely rational in a world where supply was arithmetic: deny the enemy fuel at any cost. Trails of gasoline were poured between stacked cans, white phosphorus grenades were passed out, and when the first grenade flashed, a wall of fire rose and wrote a black exclamation point into the winter sky. The inferno burned for 3 days. When Piper's lead vehicles arrived in sight of the column of smoke, he watched without speaking for minutes. Then he climbed down and summed up the truth: the Americans could afford to burn millions to keep it from us. Across the sector, the same calculus repeated. At Trois Ponts and at Spa, Engineers turned depots into firestorms rather than risk capture. In the first week alone, American forces deliberately destroyed more than 8 million gallons. The ability to do this without strategic panic came from a system that dwarfed German imagination. The Red Ball Express had already delivered hundreds of thousands of tons in its great surge, and even stripped to the bone of romance. Its numbers are astonishing: 6,000 trucks, each burning roughly 40 gallons daily in the act of moving the material that made victory possible, a system scaled to move 20,000 tons per day. On the pipeline side, Operation Pluto and its inland extensions were the quiet giants. The Cherbourg to Paris line could push something like 800,000 gallons per day. The Seine line moved another 650,000. By December, Allied armies in the northwest were consuming about 7.5 million gallons daily and receiving around 8.22 million, which meant that while German formations attacked in hopes of catching up to barrels, the Allies were stacking more barrels behind the front with every sunrise. None of this required hero worship to understand. It required reading a ledger, and the ledger made plain that what began at Honsfeld as the greatest lucky find of Piper's career was, when set against the American petroleum machine, a rounding error. The deeper Piper's armoured spearhead pushed into Belgium, the faster arithmetic turned against him. The cold, forested slopes of the Ardennes were the enemy's ally. Every incline, every twisting road magnified the appetite of steel machines that drank like beasts. A Tiger tank devoured roughly 2.5 gallons of gasoline for each mile it crawled. A Panther burned about 1.5. In the open plains, these numbers were already crippling. In the narrow, hilly tracks of the Ardennes, they rose by nearly 40%. Snow, ice, and traffic forced halts where engines idled and wasted what little remained. Even the wind that whistled through the trees seemed to whisper the truth of a doomed equation. Each mile forward cost exponentially more than any gain in ground could justify. Across the lines, the Allied command did not guess at this crisis. It knew. Signals intelligence through the Ultra program had cracked the German codes and was reading the pulse of the enemy's logistics almost in real time. Orders went out to destroy every fuel depot that might be threatened by capture. To the Allies, fuel was plentiful enough to sacrifice for strategy. To the Germans, every lost gallon was an amputation. On those same days, American C-47 transport aircraft flew over 300 sorties to resupply the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, delivering about 160,000 gallons of gasoline by air alone, more fuel in a single day than Piper's entire armoured group possessed at its peak. The skies that had once been the Luftwaffe's domain now served as an airborne pipeline for the enemy. By December 19th, Piper's situation was terminal. Tanks that had been symbols of unstoppable might stood like monuments to mechanical starvation. Crews siphoned the dregs from abandoned vehicles, consolidating what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons, a pitiful reserve that could permit one engagement or a retreat, but not both. The decision was cruel in its simplicity. To fight meant to die standing, to withdraw meant to die on foot. At the same moment, hundreds of miles behind the front, American quartermasters were approving fuel requests of a scale that mocked German desperation. The First Army's plan for January required roughly 245 million gallons of gasoline. The paperwork passed without debate. There was no drama, no midnight meeting. It was merely another line on an industrial ledger. The difference lay not only in quantity but in design. American logistics functioned as a single organism, standardized and interchangeable. The Sherman tank consumed less than 1 gallon per mile, and American trucks, when fully loaded, achieved about 8 miles to a gallon. Mechanics could swap parts between vehicles without hesitation. Oils and lubricants were uniform. Germany's motor pool, in contrast, was a museum of variety. Captured French and Soviet vehicles sat beside German, makes that required distinct oils, tires, and fittings. Each type demanded its own chain of spare parts. What looked like strength in numbers was in truth chaos on wheels. Maintenance officers spent as much time improvising compatibility as they did fighting. Every day added another wound that the supply corps could not close. By late December 18th, with fuel convoys destroyed by Allied aircraft and no resupply possible, the arithmetic of failure was explicit. Piper's staff gathered in a farmhouse and faced the grim truth. They had fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers while the Meuse lay 30 away. Their commander, usually curt and confident, now sounded almost reflective. He admitted that they were fighting an enemy capable of burning more fuel to deny it than Germany could allocate to an entire offensive. The campaign had ceased to be about courage or leadership. It was a demonstration of economic law. Encircled near the Belgian town of L'Église, Paper's remaining vehicles had perhaps 1,000 gallons of gasoline left among them. Facing him, American formations, the 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armored, held an allocation for that same day of roughly 340,000 gallons. The contrast was grotesque. Soldiers in the encircling forces joked that they used more fuel to heat coffee than the Germans had to run their tanks. For the Americans, it was a casual remark. For the Germans, it was the sound of defeat echoing in laughter. The real measure of Allied power was mobility. Where Germany stalled for lack of gallons, General George Patton's Third Army executed a 90-degree turn northward to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver that required approximately 350,000 gallons just for redeployment. To German planners, the figure was absurd. To the Americans, it was Tuesday. The transformation of liquid fuel into movement and movement into victory was the ultimate demonstration that logistics had become the new general of modern war. On December 23rd, the weather cleared, and with blue skies came the weight of air power. Nearly 2,000 Allied aircraft took to the air that day. Each Republic P-47 Thunderbolt burned about 300 gallons per hour, each Martin B-26 bomber around 200. One day of flying consumed more fuel than the entire German Ardennes offensive had been allotted from the start. While American pilots streaked above the clouds, German tanks below sat dead, their crews warming hands over makeshift fires. The same element fuel turned to flame on one side and to ash on the other. That night, Paper accepted the inevitable. Between December 23rd and 24th, he ordered the destruction of his immobilized armor. Of the 119 armored fighting vehicles that had crossed the start line a week earlier, 39 remained technically functional but stranded without fuel. The men drained whatever dribbles they could, setting fire to the hulks and blasting them with remaining ammunition to prevent capture. Millions of Reichsmarks in equipment went up in smoke, a sacrifice not to strategy but to arithmetic. When the survivors slipped away on foot through snow and darkness, only about 770 of the original 5,000 would eventually make it back to German lines. The roads behind them glittered with frost and the metallic ghosts of a lost army. Word of the debacle travelled quickly up the chain of command. Reports of captured and destroyed fuel stocks reached Field Marshal Walter Model by December 26th. His chief of staff recorded that the marshal read the figures: 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, over 8 million destroyed rather than seized, and read them again before murmuring, "We are not fighting the same war." In Berlin, Adolf Hitler rejected the data outright. Albert Speer later wrote that Hitler insisted the photographs of burning depots were Allied propaganda, perhaps film trickery from Hollywood. But in the ranks, men did not need photographs. They had seen the glow of Stavelot from miles away. Letters home carried their own testimony. The Americans destroyed more fuel in a single day than Germany received in a month. "They drive tanks as we march," one soldier wrote to his wife. "This war is lost." The collapse of illusion spread faster than any army. Industrial figures replaced ideology as the true measure of power. By 1944, the United States accounted for roughly half of the world's total manufacturing output. Aircraft rolled from assembly lines at a rate of 1 every 5 minutes. Shipyards launched a vessel each day. Tank factories produced 1 new armored machine every 7 minutes. The Axis powers combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum. When December reports in Allied headquarters mentioned that weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons per day, officers grumbled about inconvenience. That single day's shortfall still exceeded the entire offensive fuel budget of the German army group. For prisoners of war captured in the Ardennes, this was the final humiliation. They were less awed by American firepower than by American waste. They saw soldiers washing clothes in gasoline, using petrol to start campfires, feeding chocolate to dogs. Such extravagance destroyed morale more thoroughly than any bombing run. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence in the last months of the war carried the same refrain: "We cannot fight infinity." German soldiers who had been raised on myths of racial superiority now confronted the paradox that the so-called decadent Americans possessed inexhaustible wealth, while the master race scraped for drops of oil. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, generals and ministers alike testified that logistics, especially fuel, had dictated the outcome. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel confessed that by 1944 operational superiority meant nothing when divisions could not move. "We had brilliant plans," he said, "and empty fuel tanks." Even Paper, questioned years later, admitted that every decision after December 17th had been shaped by the shortage. They could not maneuver, pursue, or even retreat effectively. The Americans, he said, moved as if the world were their highway, while his men counted liters as if measuring blood. The romanticism of the blitzkrieg of daring generals and bold thrusts had died in the snow. The historian Richard Overy later calculated the ratio that sealed the fate of nations allied to Axis. Production exceeded 5-1 in major categories, but in petroleum it approached 50-1. No amount of training, courage, or tactical genius could balance that scale. The production statistics were merciless. The United States built about 325,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced roughly 120,000. American factories turned out 88,000 tanks to Germany's 47,000. Yet these figures were secondary to the fluid that made them move. In 1944 alone, American refineries processed 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany, with all its synthetic output and captured fields, barely reached 33 million. The German celebration at Honsfeld that morning of supposed deliverance thus shrank in hindsight to absurdity. The 50,000 gallons they had hailed as salvation amounted to what one American armored division consumed in less than 2 days, what the Red Ball Express burned in under 3 hours, a rounding error in an empire of supply. Through late December, the immutable mathematics continued to grind. While German formations consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons during the entire offensive, the United States used about 267 million in the same period. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft, but its most devastating loss was invisible: the death of belief. Those who survived understood that they had not been beaten by courage or even by numbers of men, but by the scale of industry and the reach of oil. Paper survived captivity, though later assassinated under uncertain circumstances. In interviews before his death, he returned again to that winter dawn. Finding the American depot, he said, had been the worst thing. If they had run out earlier, they might have withdrawn with dignity, but the discovery of such abundance turned the campaign into a revelation of impossibility. "We found oceans," he told a historian, "while we held only drops." From that moment, the lesson became inescapable. Industrial warfare was not an arena for heroism, but for systems. Logistics crushed tactics. Production outweighed valor. The German soldier of 1944 may have been better trained, but the American soldier was carried by a machine that could afford to waste what others would die to conserve. Every jerrycan at Honsfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline snaking through France encoded the same message: victory would belong to the nation whose factories never slept. The disparity filtered down to the individual. Each American soldier in the European theatre was supported by roughly 67 pounds of supplies per day: food, fuel, ammunition, clothing. The average German received scarcely 3. What one side called waste, the other called life. In 1984, 4 decades after the battle veterans gathered at La Glise before the museum that now houses Piper's abandoned Tiger tank, its fuel gauge, still pointing to empty, had become an artifact of arithmetic. An American veteran looked at his former adversary and asked, half-joking, why the Germans had stopped there. The answer came with a bitter laugh: "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" The American was silent, then admitted, "We had so much we never thought about it." That brief exchange distilled the entire winter of 1944 into a single truth. One side measured by the gallon, the other by the million. One side fought for each, can the other drowned in oceans of supply. The war's outcome had been decided long before the first engine turned over, not on the battlefield, but in the refineries, the shipyards, and the endless convoys that transformed crude oil into the lifeblood of victory. The diaries kept by soldiers on both sides in those December days read like messages from 2 separate worlds. German entries filled with the arithmetic of depletion, how many liters left, how many kilometers possible, stood beside American notes describing deliveries so vast that quartermasters struggled to find space for storage. On December 17th, Piper's men had rejoiced over the captured 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, believing it a divine reprieve. Yet even as they pumped those American jerrycans dry, Allied depots farther west were receiving multi-million-gallon shipments through pipelines that never slept. Each sunrise widened the gap. German units counted survival by the can. American armies counted strategy by the reservoir. That imbalance was not only a matter of quantity but of quality. The fuel that powered the American war machine was the product of an advanced chemical revolution Germany could neither match nor interrupt. In the refineries of Texas, New Jersey, and California, engineers had perfected catalytic cracking, a process that extracted more energy from each barrel and produced higher-octane aviation fuel in enormous quantities. American aircraft drank 100-octane gasoline enriched with additives such as tetraethyl lead and ethylene dibromide compounds that boosted performance and engine life. German chemists working under bombardment and shortages relied on older hydrogenation methods that yielded low-grade synthetic fuels. Even when Piper's men captured barrels of American gasoline, their engines sometimes rebelled. The too hot octane caused misfires in tanks designed for 74. The irony was painful. The invaders could not properly digest the wealth they had stolen. While German engineers puzzled over octane ratings, the consequences of scarcity bled into every corner of the front. Fuel starvation did not only halt tanks, it crippled mercy. Ambulances stood idle beside the wounded because their tanks were dry. Field hospitals, stripped of generator power, performed surgery by candlelight or could not sterilize instruments at all. Doctors wrote that men died who could have been saved by 10 kilometers of transport or 10 liters of gasoline. In a war of machines, the lack of fuel meant not only the loss of mobility, but the collapse of civilization's simplest promises: light, heat, motion, and care. Against that grim stillness, the sight of American excess was almost unbearable. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary that morale at the front was breaking down. Soldiers wrote home describing Allied convoys, so long they seemed to have no beginning or end, depots stacked like mountain ranges, trucks that idled for warmth instead of conserving fuel. Censors tried to intercept such letters, but rumors traveled faster than repression. Every photograph of a burning Allied depot intended as proof of German triumph became instead evidence of difference. If the enemy could afford to destroy oceans of gasoline, what meaning did another German tactical success carry? The story of heroic resistance dissolved in the glare of Allied floodlights powered by the very fuel Germany lacked. By the close of the Ardennes campaign, the senior leadership no longer pretended ignorance. Generals in the high command understood that all aces now belonged to the Allies. Fuel production inside Germany collapsed entirely by February of 1945. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was grounded not by defeat in the sky but by emptiness in its tanks. Training flights ceased. New pilots graduated from simulators without ever having touched the clouds. Navy crews sat beside their vessels waiting for orders that never came because there was not enough diesel to leave port. A nation that had dreamed of lightning warfare had been reduced to still life. Surrender, when it came, often arrived not through encirclement or annihilation but through paralysis. Entire panzer divisions destroyed their own armored vehicles because they lacked the fuel to move or even to withdraw. Tanks with full magazines and trained crews were blown apart on the roadside simply to prevent capture. Soldiers walked toward Allied lines with their hands raised not from cowardice but from immobility. The American advance, by contrast, slowed only because the highways clogged with its own vehicles. Traffic jams, not opposition, became the greatest obstacle to progress. What Paper had seen at Honsfeld had already foretold this ending. In that early morning revelation, he glimpsed the core truth of modern war: the enemy's waste exceeded his own nation's need. Germany had allocated roughly 5 million gallons for its winter gamble. The Americans destroyed 8 million to keep it from falling into German hands. Allied armies burned about 7.5 million gallons every single day, making Paper's captured treasure of 50,000 a mere fraction, about 0.6% of what the Allies consumed between dawn and dusk. Numbers alone told the story. Courage and tactical brilliance could not convert arithmetic into miracles. The Battle of the Bulge left behind staggering losses, around 19,000 Americans and 100,000 Germans dead or missing, thousands more wounded, and towns reduced to ash. Yet the most profound casualty was illusion. Among German ranks, the myth of technological superiority died beside empty vehicles. Soldiers who had been taught that spirit and discipline could overcome material odds now saw that abundance itself was a weapon more decisive than any gun. The Americans had not merely outfought them, they had outproduced reality. Even after the fighting ended, the scale mismatch continued to mock the defeated. When Allied engineers catalogued the battlefield near La Glaise, they found 39 German tanks in perfect mechanical condition, abandoned solely for want of fuel. To return them to operational status would have required about 8,000 gallons of gasoline, a quantity so small that American officers listed it in reports as a minor local requisition. For the US Army, it was paperwork. For Germany, it had been impossibility. The salvage irony underlined everything paper had discovered, that winter between industrial nations, victory belonged to whoever could afford to treat scarcity as inconvenience. The truth had been written years earlier, long before the first Tiger rolled into Belgium. Once American industry mobilized fully in 1942, the war's outcome became an equation with only one answer. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Houston had outpaced any conceivable European response. Every gallon refined, every barrel shipped, every pipeline laid across France was a statement of inevitability. Germany fought not merely a stronger enemy, but an impossible one. Defeat was measured in gallons, while victory was measured in oceans. Today, the Tiger tank that once led paper's column sits preserved in the museum at La Glaise. Visitors often ask the same question: why would soldiers abandon such a formidable machine? The answer requires no drama. There was no enemy shell, no mechanical failure, no sabotage. The needle on the fuel gauge points to empty. That single line of metal behind glass explains everything. It marks the boundary between imagination and reality, between the legend of invincible armor and the truth of a nation that could not fill its tanks. The parallel diaries that chronicled those final days close the story with cruel symmetry. In the German notebooks, the last entries count downward: 10 liters, 5 none. Engines fall silent. In the American records, supply officers tally upward: 1 million gallons received 1.8 million issued reserves, increasing by 200,000. Where one side recorded subtraction, the other logged accumulation. It was not a duel of men, but of systems, and the systems had already decided who would endure. The superiority of American fuel chemistry, invisible yet omnipresent, symbolized an entire philosophy of war. Catalytic cracking, high-octane blends, and additives like tetraethyl lead were the practical fruits of scientific capitalism, the conversion of knowledge into horsepower. German reliance on synthetic substitutes showed how ideology and scarcity strangled innovation. Even in triumph, Piper's captured fuel betrayed him. It ignited too fiercely a metaphor for the war itself, brilliant for a moment, self-consuming in the end. As the front lines collapsed, the humanitarian consequences of starvation multiplied. Ambulances without gasoline became coffins on wheels. Generators ceased to hum, and hospitals reverted to the age of oil lamps. Winter cold crept through wards where wounded men froze beside the instruments meant to save them. In such scenes, the difference between victory and defeat was measured not in glory but in heat and light. Meanwhile, Allied convoys rolled through liberated towns lit by electric bulbs, their vehicles running engines even while parked to keep crews warm. To the observing Germans, these sights were unbearable proof of imbalance. Goebbels could command sensors, but he could not censor the sky itself, glowing at night from Allied searchlights and the reflection of fuel fires. The old propaganda of sacrifice and destiny sounded hollow when set against the humming of engines that never stopped. By the beginning of 1945, the German command ceased to dream of counter-offensives. The final reports from the Petroleum Ministry read like obituary notices. Production had dwindled to statistical noise. The Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft sat tethered to the earth. What little fuel remained was reserved for evacuations and retreat. The myth of mobility, once the pride of blitzkrieg, ended in columns of infantry trudging west while American convoys thundered east. When surrender finally came in May, it was less a collapse than a silence. Engines stopped one by one until Europe heard its own breath again. The victors moved past wrecks that looked intact, wondering how such machines could have failed. The answer lay not in armor thickness or gun caliber, but in the invisible lifeblood of petroleum. Without it, all machinery, political, military, ideological ground to a halt. The episode at Honsfeld, replayed in hindsight, stands as the parable of that truth. A single morning's discovery of abundance turned revelation. The Germans had thought they fought a war of armies. They were in fact participants in an industrial census, and they were outnumbered not by divisions but by refineries. Piper's 50,000 gallons, which once promised resurrection, became a symbol of futility, a candle flickering beside a furnace. The Tiger tank preserved in La Glaise closes the narrative with a silence more eloquent than any testimony. Its paint is faded, its tracks rusted, yet the cockpit instruments remain. The fuel gauge rests at 0. Children press their faces to the glass and ask why it stopped. The guide answers softly it had no fuel. That truth, simple and absolute, contains the story of a continent and the century that followed. The empty gauge is not merely an artifact, it is a monument to the moment when tactical genius met logistical reality and lost. It teaches that wars of machines are won not by glory but by gallons, and that the greatest weapon of the 20th century was not the tank or the plane but the pipeline.